The biology of personality. Welcome back one last time, everyone. It is me, Tim, the red-nosed, increasingly lecturer on this. One more of these videos to get through before I can go fall apart on a bed somewhere with my illness. So we've covered the trait approach, which is the 5-factor model, the main descriptive way that we ever talk about personality in modern psychology. We've talked about the three main, although each of them incomplete, theories of personality development and how they're all quite different from each other but are partially compatible in different ways. Last thing we're going to talk about here is an alternate approach to the development of personality. The people who lean on the trait approach on this often try to just completely forsake these three developmental theories we're talking about here and instead say, well, maybe the differences that we see on a descriptive level just come out fully formed. Maybe they're just genetic differences or something like this. And the interesting thing is that they're not entirely wrong. There is a certain degree of influence in that sense. I will explain as we get into it. So this what I'm showing you here, this biology of personality approach, I have to again emphasize, doesn't play especially well with psychodynamics, really doesn't play very well with the humanistic approach, and is okay, but doesn't play super well with the social cognitive approach either. This is kind of an alternative to a standard developmental model of personality. This instead leans on the idea of, well, what if a big part of whatever personality you're going to develop has an underlying set of biological causes that we don't fully understand, but we can predict if we look at your patterns of genetic relatedness and, to a certain extent, the cortices of your brain. So this alternate path relies on this idea of saying, well, let's just look at personality traits. We know that we have that down pat. We know we have a great way of using traits to describe the variation in the population at any given moment, how any one person differs from another, and then try to correlate those trait differences, those descriptive differences, with genetic, physiological, and neurological factors that underpin them. Like I was saying before, the 5-factor model approach is completely atheoretical. It doesn't have an underlying explanation for why these traits are the way they are, but there are researchers in the world right now who are saying, yeah, forget about trying to put together a comprehensive developmental theory. What we need to do is just figure out why the 5-factor model comes out the way it does, and then maybe that'll give us clues that we just otherwise never had to figure out how personality gets to the levels that it eventually has. The key insight that I'm giving on this, and it will structure everything we talk about here, is that when people started looking for these things, genetic, physiological, and neurological underpinnings for psychological personality variants, personality turned out to be far more biologically based than we ever used to think back in the day. First and foremost, the simplest population genetics things that they did on the matter was say, okay, we can track differences between adult individuals on the level of the 5-factor model traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Do they correlate within families? Is there a genetic heritability of whatever level of each of these personality traits you're going to have? And the simple answer is yes, there is a heritability factor to it, but more importantly, it's not a small heritability factor. A lot of psychological properties have a heritability factor of 0.2 or something like this. 20% of the variance in it is genetically heritable. But look at what it's like in personality. Openness to new experience, on average, is 57% genetically heritable. Conscientiousness is 49% genetically heritable. Extroversion is 54%, agreeableness 42%, neuroticism 48% genetically heritable. That's really high, relatively speaking. That's on average, just a little bit below 50% overall. Around half of the variation in your personality, half of what makes your personality the way it is, has some biological underpinning, is genetically shared with people who have the same genes as you. I mean, nothing has that good a heritability factor in psychology, with the exception of things like intelligence. General intelligence has sometimes as high as 60% genetic heritability, but even then, that's about as high as it goes. This is very impressive. This is just some quick data about the very first ever identical versus dizygotic twin studies that were ever done on this. And as you can see, monozygotic twins, people who share 100% of their genetics with each other, regardless of what else is happening with their upbringing and things like this, relative to siblings just born at the same time, are more than twice as similar in their personalities than dizygotic or non-identical twins are. It's very impressive. So we also know when we look at these things, excuse me. We also know that when we look at these things, that different regions of the brain, different functional regions of the brain, are associated with different levels of activity. Different levels of activity and different cortical densities, I should say, in different parts of the brain are associated with different levels of the 5-factor traits. Greater openness to new experience is related to the parietal cortex. If you have more activity in the parietal cortex of your brain, it's not really a structural difference, but it's an activity difference that predicts more openness to new experience. Higher volume in your left prefrontal cortex is associated with higher conscientiousness. Higher volume of your medial-orbitofrontal cortex, so the ones around the orbits of your eyes at the front here, is associated with greater extroversion. Higher volume of your posterior cingulate cortex. Your cingulate cortex is like the lower front part of your limbic system, so it's still in the frontal lobes, but deep on the inside in here. That's associated with higher agreeableness. And higher volumes in your mid-cingulate gyrus, so a bit deeper down here, is associated with higher neuroticism. And less density in your prefrontal cortex is associated with higher neuroticism as well. So we know that, part of this genetic inheritance that we have over here, part of what makes this genetic inheritance possible is how your brain structures itself. Whether you have, relative amounts of more or less of certain kinds of neurological circuits changes the way that you're likely to manage your personality, by the time that you're an adult. So, this is in its infancy. People are figuring out more and more about this along the way. But some of the most interesting anecdotes about change in personality that we have relate to what we've now discovered are these cortical regions relative to how you process your personality. My favorite examples, of course, are frontal lobe syndromes. So you will have noticed from that the orbital and prefrontal and cingulate areas of the brain, all around the kind of front here, are some of the main areas that are relevant to personality. We already knew that to a certain extent because there were famous historical case studies where people got damage to their frontal lobe and developed what we call frontal lobe syndromes, which, even though people tend to survive them and they tend to be perfectly fine under some circumstances, physically speaking, they tend to develop enormous differences in personality. The most famous of these examples is the case of a man whose name was Phineas Gage. And this is an illustration of what happened to him. He was a railroad worker who was tapping in a railroad spike to compact some dynamite in a hole. The dynamite exploded from a spark, and the railroad spike jammed up through his skull, came out the top, caused him to lose one of his eyes, and put a big hole right through a big part of his frontal lobe. But they were able to put him together, do surgery on and things like this, and he survived. He was perfectly physically okay, except from the loss of his eye and some drainage issues around his jaw and all of this. There's a picture of him at the time. But the main complications he developed were personality complications. He showed only relatively mild cognitive deficits. He didn't lose a lot of his wit or intelligence or anything like this. But despite being a very likable, amiable man before the time of the accident, after that, his personality radically changed. When he lost some of these prefrontal cortical regions, he became brash, uninhibited, rude, inconsiderate, to an almost criminal degree. If he saw a very attractive woman, he would start touching himself inappropriately because he couldn't inhibit the desire to do that. If he was at a restaurant and liked the food on somebody else's plate more than his, he would just reach out and pull it off their plate and start eating it. He would insult people and shout in their faces without thinking about it. These are essentially personality differences, but we understand that the circuits that gave him the pre-existing level of personality control that he had, the level of conscientiousness and agreeableness that he had, have been changed because he lost those circuits out of his brain when the railroad spike went through his head. So that's always an important thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with people who have brain injuries, especially if you're dealing with geriatric populations that are developing dementia and things like this. We think of personality as being, part of your ghost in the machine, the inner nature of who you are. But just like intelligence, it is an individual differences domain that works on the basis of how the circuits of your brain are calibrated. And just like how you can lose your cognitive abilities over time as your brain starts to change, or if you have damage ongoing to your brain, you can lose important defining characteristics of your personality exactly the same way because of their underlying biological basis. So that brings us to the end of this. You now know essentially everything you need to know on the matter of personality that will be mopped up on in the face-to-face lecture and obviously in the tutorials as well. I'll see my tutorial group then when we get to it. In the meantime, the next time you'll hear from me will be about, probably, that is to say, because we might switch it around a little bit, but will probably be social cognition. I will see you all then. Hopefully, I will not be as sick then. Wish me luck.